Hello everybody, my name is Jared Bendis, and today we're going to do an introduction to digital video. Now, we're going to talk about the technical things that go into how video clips are made, how we get a video clip and what's behind the scenes in it. I want you to imagine that you have holding in your hand a video clip. And to understand that video clip, to understand what it's like to process, to work with, and to edit video, we really need to understand a little bit about sort of like, well, what is it, a little bit of the history of it, and a little bit of the future of it. So let's get started. So what is video? Well, when you see me in real life, this isn't real life, by the way, this is video. But when you see me in real life walking in front of you, you're actually seeing me walk in front of you. But when you're seeing me on your screen, what you're actually seeing is a rapid succession of still images that give you the illusion of motion that we call video. Now, these rapid succession of images work because of something called persistence of vision. You don't see the multiple pictures going by. Now, each picture that goes by is called a frame. And that's where we begin. A frame is the single picture that is made up. And these frames go by in rapid succession, and we get the illusion of motion. Now, the question, of course, first question is, how big is the picture? That's a really good question. Because as we start to think about what we're looking at here, we've got to ask ourselves, what is the size of the picture? Now, up until recently, video wasn't digital. We started out with film. And with film, it becomes a matter of looking at crystalline structures, and the idea of looking at pictures developed film. And then we went from film to television. And television isn't digital. It wasn't digital then either. It was analog, and television was broken up differently than we'll talk about in a second. And then we get to what we are looking at now, which is digital. And with digital, when we talk about a picture, we end up talking about the magic word known as resolution. And resolution, let's get to the better, there we go, resolution. And resolution is the number of pixels tall something is, wide something is, and the number of pixels tall something is. So width by height in pixels. And that's what we're talking about, the resolution of a still picture. And in this case, we're going to be talking about the resolution of video. Now, there are multiple flavors of video. There didn't used to be, but now there are, and we're going to have to talk about all of them. So when we're talking about video, we're talking about pictures going by, and with all pictures, at least in the digital world, we're going to talk about the resolution of the pictures. That is, the number of pixels wide, but the number of pixels tall it is. And those are our individual frames. All right, so far so good. Let me clear my page. Good, very good. So now we're going to start out in the early days of film and ask the question, how many pictures must go by? At what speed do the pictures have to go by to fool the human eye? And in the early days, they didn't know. They tried an enormous number of pictures. But what they found out, and what we've settled on in the standards that we deal with, is that when you're looking at 24 frames per second, that's frames per second, it's also known as the frame rate. Both of those words mean the same thing. How many frames per second? Movies are at 24 frames per second. Television used to be at 30 frames per second. And I say used to be because of something strange that happened in the history of television. See, for most of television's history, television was black and white. And when they made color television, they actually had to squeeze the color signal into the same signal. And when they did that, they slowed television down so that modern color televisions, and that is color televisions in the 50s and 60s onwards, used a frame rate of 29.97 frames per second. Now, that may seem like a horrible number to have to remember, and you really don't need to remember it. What you need to remember is, well, that's about 30. The real thing is you're going to see that number in the software. When you go to edit video, you're going to see 29.97, because back in the days of analog television, you were dealing with 29.97 frames per second, not 30 frames per second. Now that we've gone digital, you're actually going to see people are starting to do a true 30 frames per second. You may have heard about this trend of, instead of doing 24 frames a second, to do 48 frames per second for films. and it becomes this hyper realism, which is very, very strange. What you don't realize is that when you're seeing a person walk by you, it's super crisp. But when you see somebody walk by you quickly on film, there's a little bit of like a motion blur that you've become accustomed to. You actually know when you look at the screen, you expect to see these sort of temporal artifacts that you don't see in real life, which is why you look at the real world and go, "Ooh, that's real world." But when you see high frame rate video, it becomes hyper real, which is actually one of the cool things that you're seeing in the future, but you're not used to hyper realism yet, so it freaks you out. So we'll start seeing these things coming forward, but the answer is 24 frames per second was mostly its film, 30 frames per second was television, 29.97 frames per second is mostly what you're going to see. Modern cameras will do 30. They will even do, you'll see 60 done frequently as well. Even cooler, you'll see a lot of the action cameras, which will boast that they can do 120 or even 240 frames per second. Now, why would you want to do 240 frames a second? Well, it's an action camera. And here's the trick. If you record 240 frames per second, but you only need 30 frames per second, that means you could slow the footage down by a factor of, well, 24 divided by 8. You can slow the footage down by, is that 8? Yeah, that's 8. By a factor of 8, and all of a sudden have slow motion that is perfectly crisp. And that's what's cool about these cameras. So when you start seeing really, really expensive cameras, the higher frame rate is basically so that you can play it back at the lower frame rate, see it super smooth, and there you go. So frames per second is a really big part of what we're going to be looking at. And again, it depends on which camera you're using, and it depends on where your footage comes from. So far, so good? Good. I'm glad. So we're going to put that off in the corner. We're always going to remember that frames per second, or our frame rate, is right there waiting for us. Now we need to talk about the resolution of television. What is the resolution of television? Well, the question is, what kind of television? And we're going to go back a little bit, and we're going to go back and talk about the early days. Because remember, everything we do now is grounded in the things that we were doing then. We're in a digital age. So everything we're doing now is, beautiful flat screen televisions, high definition. Ooh, I just used a fancy term. High definition, HD, right? HD. As opposed to what? Well, if we've got HD now, the older version is called SD, or standard definition. And standard definition was what television was for the longest time. And a lot of what we're going to do is to truly understand video is do a little bit of history about how this all works together. So let's talk about standard definition versus high definition. The first thing you're going to remember is that high definition has a beautiful widescreen, and standard definition is kind of, well, it's kind of squarish. And when we talk about the shape of our screen, we're talking about a very important term called the aspect ratio. And the aspect ratio is basically the relationship between the width and the height. It's the shape of a rectangle. With standard definition, the aspect ratio generally was 4:3, and with modern high definition screens, we're dealing with 16:9. Matter of fact, this video is being recorded in 16:9. And of course, your monitor is probably 16:9. Almost everything we do these days is 16:9. But in the olden days, when televisions were squarish, they were actually an aspect ratio of 4:3. And that gives you a sense of, again, what the shape of the screen was. We're going to get back to HD a little bit later, but almost everything that we deal with in HD comes from what we did in SD. Now, technically, you don't have to listen to any of this if you want to jump ahead to the next video and just start editing. But if you're going to really start doing any delicate work with video, understanding all of these terms will make you a better editor. It'll also make you a better producer. Let's erase our screen again by FPS. So dealing with standard definition, we've got our screen, right? We've got our 4:3 aspect ratio screen. So what is the resolution of the video? What is the resolution? Well, we have to understand that for the most part, there's always going to be little variations and there's strange technicalities. I'm giving you the big hand-waving tour. Good enough to be honest, though. The resolution of video, standard definition video, is 720 by 480. Now that's 720 pixels wide, 480 pixels tall. And we also put in the frame rate. So generally, we refer to this as 720 by 480 at 29.97. And this, by the way, is the resolution of your standard DVD. So, or if you were dealing with video up until modern times, up until the HD revolution, everything was 720 by 480 at 29.97 frames per second. And that's how we would refer to it. But there's one more wrinkle that we have to deal with. Well, two more wrinkles that we have to deal with. And the first wrinkle is to understand how the old televisions used to work. Now, the old televisions used to work by drawing lines on the screen. The television screen was a big old glass tube, right? We're going to kind of look at it from the side. Big old glass tube. And there was an electron gun here that would actually draw the picture. And when it would draw the picture, it would draw these lines on the screen, and we'll actually draw them. So it would literally draw, and it would draw the lines of resolution. And that's, by the way, where when we talk about the lines of resolution, we're talking about these lines. We're talking about the 480 lines of resolution. The problem with these glass televisions and the little electron guns and the phosphor dots is that by the time you drew the bottom of the screen, the top of the screen had already faded away. This was a technology problem. So, to combat that technology problem, they broke up the frame into two individual fields. Let me explain. Instead of drawing line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4, line 5, line 6, no, what they would do is they would draw all of the odd frames, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and then afterwards they would go back and they would fill in and draw 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, which of course I can draw much prettier. So they would go 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, get all the way down to the bottom of the screen, and then come back again and go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And this is what we refer to in the business as interlaced. An interlaced video, An interlaced video means that our frame is made up of two fields, the even fields and the odd fields. And so this is very important because that means is that every moment in time is a half a frame, another half a frame, and a half frame, another half frame. Now, what's weird about this is as follows. The televisions were interlaced, the signals were interlaced, and so you never saw the half a frame, the half a frame. You basically saw it. But because our modern screens don't work this way, if you would ever see an interlaced signal played on your computer screen, you're not going to see half a frame, half a frame, half a frame, half a frame. You're going to see both of those fields at the same time, and you'll see weird little jagged edges, and that's called an interlaced signal. So when your signal is interlaced, but your display is what's called progressive, where it shows everything at once, we run into an issue. DVDs, traditional DVDs, were always, for the most part, interlaced. Up until then, television was interlaced, video cameras were interlaced. Interlaced was the thing. And matter of fact, we refer to our little 480, we refer to this as 480i, or 480 interlaced lines of resolution. And this becomes very important because if we were to ever digitize from a videotape, you realize that the videotape is 480 interlaced lines, and during areas of high motion, you'll see weird little jaggedy edges. If you're not dealing with videotapes, or you're not dealing with digitizing from videotapes or DVDs, this isn't a problem. Modern cameras tend not to be interlaced. They tend to all be progressive. But again, I don't know what you're dealing with, and also this vocabulary leads from one to the other. So this is, now, one last thing, by the way. This is the North American standard. This is NTSC. There are different standards for video in different parts of the world. There's NTSC and there's PAL. There was a third standard for videotapes called CCAM. That's a different story. And if you're like, well, wait a second, why are there different standards in the world? Standards are a funny thing. And let me explain one real reason why. When television was first invented, like in the 20s, they needed to put a very complex timing circuit inside of the television so everything could stay synchronized. This is like the 20s. And it's expensive to build timing circuits. So instead of building a timing circuit, what they did is they used the timing circuit that was already built into everybody's house, which was the frequency of the alternating current. And so in the US, where we have 60 hertz, we ended up with the 30 frames per second. And in Europe, where they had 50 hertz, you ended up with the 25 frames per second. And if you want to actually know which country uses which standard, you basically follow colonialism. It's the way the world works. So what you're going to find is there are very few people that use NTSC, but the US and Canada are the big ones, and so there you go. And that's based on the power systems. Now, obviously now it's not that big of a deal, but that is where the split comes from. So while we're doing 29.97 frames per second because of the 30, they're doing 24 point because it was 50. Their resolution is slightly different as well, and there's some other little things. But for the most part, you need to understand that the video standards are different in Europe and America. All right. So now we have a good basic understanding of the main things that we need to know. We know that a standard definition clip is 720 by 480 at 29.97 frames per second, and that 480 lines of resolution are interlaced together. That is standard definition. There's one last little wrinkle I need to put into play here, and I'll explain it real fast. If you were to sit there, and I told you that standard definition was a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. And if you were to do your math, you'd go, wait a second, 720 by 480 is not a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. 640 by 480 is a 4 by 3 aspect ratio. And you would be correct. The problem with video is the pixels aren't square, which always confuses people. The data may be square, the data is just data. The pixels on the screen, the actual dots when you zoom in on them, aren't actually little squares on a television, they're little rectangles. And that's how they're turned into the screen. And that's why if you ever had a chance to play a widescreen DVD, which is still standard definition, you would find that that was a 16 by 9 signal. And it also was 720 by 480. It just was a pre-stretched image, and they would just distribute the pixels differently on the screen. And this idea of non-square pixels is not something you need to really know about, but when we go into the software and it tells you that the pixels aren't square, you're going to go, what? That's right. But now that we've done this, now that we've had a little bit of history here, we can jump ahead to modern times. HD. HD. Now with HD, we are always dealing with 16 by 9. And as I told you before, we're dealing with the width by height at frames per second. That's how we look at it. When we're talking about HD, there are 3 different flavors of HD. They're not competing standards. They're all considered HD. But we always only talk about the second number. And the 3 different types of HD are either 720 progressive lines. Again, the first line is computed. The first number is computed from the second number. 1080 interlaced lines, or better yet, 1080 progressive lines. Now, the reason that this is important is that each one of these 3 standards can be called HD. When you go to the store and you buy a smaller size television, let's say a 23-inch television, it's not going to be 1080p. It's probably going to be 720p, and it's still considered HD. You'll rarely see a 1080i television. Interlace is a bad thing, but sometimes you'll see older cameras that'll be HD cameras, but they may record 720p or 1080i, and they're all considered HD. The 1080p, which of course is the best HD, they will sometimes call this full HD. And for the most part, that's modern times what we're going to be dealing with. But I don't know what files you're going to be dealing with. I don't know what cameras you're going to be dealing with. And there are settings throughout that can always screw you over. So when we do this, we're going to look at it. It's going to be 1920 by 1080p. And this is full HD. And matter of fact, I'm going to be shooting, when I do my demos, I'm going to be shooting with my, my phone. And then my phone is going to be set to HD. Now, 1920, look at that, it's 1920, it's 1920 pixels across, and because it's 1920 pixels across, they sometimes will refer to that as 2K video, or 2000 pixels across. I think you know where I'm going. Because the next thing that we've got, the next best thing, is where we talk about 4K video. And 4K video is where you take the 2K and you double it, and you double it, and you double it. So 2K plus 2K. And so literally, it's not even double, it's quadrupled. And 4K video is, oh my God, even better. That being said, if you're going to shoot 4K video, you've got these giant files, and of course, you've got giant editing to do and lots of other things. But for the most part, you're going to be dealing with the modern side of things, which is 1920 by 1080p. Now, we also are going to be dealing with different frame rates. You might find it 30 frames per second. You might find it 60 frames per second. You might still find it 29.97 frames per second, because that number is never going to die. It just isn't. It's one of those things. So understanding what you're starting with is very important. And so all of these things come into play. It's actually not that many numbers. I'm sorry to do this to you, but there aren't that many numbers. There's the width, there's the height, there's the frames per second. Now, the good news is that also you're going to be dealing with the fact that almost all televisions these days are 16 by 9. Hallelujah. So now that we've got this, we've got all of our data to go, we've got to somehow package it. And packaging our data is a two-pronged process. Let's move along. Here we go. So right now we have data. We have a lot of data. And the data is stored in a box. And this box is called a file format. And the file format is basically something that holds the data. Now, there are many, many file formats out there, and we have to be a little bit careful, because in the early days, the file format game was a very strange one. The big file formats were things like AVI, which stands for Audio Video Interlaced, or Interleaved, and MOV, which was QuickTime's movie format. And these boxes are fairly generic. What I mean by them is that while they are generic, you don't know what kind of AVI, you don't know what kind of MOV. Because the file format is the box, but inside of the box is something known as a codec, which stands for compressor decompressor. And this is the magic equation that stores the data. The data is never actually stored in its entirety. We always have to throw away some data. And some data gets thrown away a lot. We have to compress the data. We have to do something to schematize it. This idea of lossless or uncompressed video data, almost unheard of. Video is just too big, so we're always going to do something to make the video smaller. And we're going to use something called a codec. Now, the reason this became a challenge in the early days, and again, in the early days, is that there was always a starting point. There was a list. So let's say there were 5 different flavors of AVI, and there were 8 different flavors of MOV, and which meant that if you used one of the generic ones, my AVI would play on my computer, and the AVI would play on your computer as well. But sometimes you would install a piece of hardware or a piece of software, and it would add to your computer a special codec. And if you installed it with that special codec, then it would play on my computer. And if I put it on my computer, it would play on my computer. But if I handed you the file, well, you would know it was a video file because it was an AVI. When you would go to play it, the screen would be black because it would say it wouldn't know what codec it was. Because audio uses its own series of codecs, and because almost all computers can play all audio files, what would happen would be is that you wouldn't see the video, but frustratingly enough, you'd hear the audio, which would be just like this horrible tease. So the idea is that you need to sort of know not what file format you're using, but also what codec you're using. And a lot of times we would use proprietary codecs, ones that would come with the hardware that we'd use. And this becomes very challenging because even today, someone who's been in the field for a long time, I might have a video file from 20 years ago, and I go to open it, and it won't open because I don't have the codec installed anymore, and the codec may not even be supported anymore. So one of the ways that we got around this is of course, standards are a good thing, is that some of the video file formats became synonymous with their codecs. For instance, the heart of every DVD uses a file called an MPEG-2. Now, MPEG-2 is really, an MPEG is the file format, and MPEG-2 is the codec. But the good news is that most people, when they see MPEG, they just assume MPEG-2 because that's what it was. The most common video file format right now is MPEG-4, MP4 file. And MPEG-4 is actually a misnomer. It's a codec that is also a video file. It's actually, the codec is H.264, but that's a different story. But the point is that we've unified the file format and the codecs so that you rarely get into a situation where you have a video file that won't play. We use standards. But in the early days, you would find these really weird codecs that you would have that you couldn't open. And if you're doing pro level video, this can still happen. I can actually encode a video file on one machine, take it over another machine, and it won't work that well. Again, most of the time, we're going to be dealing with MPEG-4. It's the standard these days. But how much MPEG-4? What do I mean by that? Well, let's segue over to the next section as well. We know how much pixels we have, right? We know how many pixels we have. We have this many pixels over this amount of time. But when we go to put it together, we need to ask ourselves not what the frame rate is, right? We know what the frame rate is. We need to ask ourselves, what is the data rate? How much data per second am I allocating to the codec for it to be able to save the data? If I allocate a lot of data, then I get higher quality. If I allocate a little bit of data, then I get lower quality. And the codec does its magic, and it only does as well as it could. MPEG-4, by the way, is an amazing codec because you can really compress the crap out of it, and it looks really, really good. Almost every video you see on YouTube is an MPEG-4 file. The trick is there's two types of MPEG-4 files. There's an MPEG-4 files that you would be what we call a source file, and then there'd be an MPEG-4 file that would be an output file. The MPEG-4 files coming off of my phone are a lot higher quality than the MPEG-4 files I'm going to upload to YouTube, which often becomes a problem because if you hand me an edited file, if you hand me a smaller produced file and ask me to edit it, it's going to be a lot more work because I'm going to have to do a lot more crunching on it. And also because I've already edited it once, I'm going to go edit, and I'm going to get iterative failures. And I'm basically going to get copies of copies, and you're going to get weird little things that happen. Editing an edited video sucks, as you've probably seen before. Now, the good news is that some of these file formats are designed for capturing, and they do an amazing job. So, for instance, if I was to try to capture in the olden days, remember we had old cameras, right? Little camcorders, right? Little camcorders with the DV tapes in them, little DV tapes. Well, if I were to do that, I would get an AVI file that used the DV codec, and it would be 11 gigabytes per hour. And that would be the source file. That would be the data rate. 11 gigabytes per hour. I think it's like 200 megabytes a minute. It's ridiculous. But obviously we're not doing 11 gigabytes per hour anymore. And that's what's really cool, is that while DV codec AVIs are 11 gigabytes an hour, I can do a lot better with HD. That's SD. I can do a lot better with HD using an MPEG-4 file and even get better looking quality. It's just the way the math has worked. We've got better math. And by the way, this is going to come up. Do you need to memorize all this? No, I'm going to walk you through it when the time comes. But it's nice to know all of these things. It's nice to realize that when we have all of this raw data, the data is compressed, altered, some of it's kept, some of it's thrown away, based on which compressor we've used, codec, and what data rate we've assigned to it. We've given it some idea of what to do with it, and then it's put inside of a file format. We are much more transparent with our file formats today than we used to be. And the idea being is that if I have an MPEG-4 file, I know it's an MPEG-4 file. But if I have an AVI or an MOV file, I don't know what codec it's using, and I'll have to use a third-party piece of software to investigate it. And again, I don't know what kind of video you're editing. Is it video that you've made or video you've acquired? And a lot of times I deal with both of those types of projects. So, in a nutshell, I'm going to be dealing with video from my phone, which is going to be 1920 by 1080 at 29.97 frames per second. It is going to be progressive, and it is going to be an MPEG-4 file, which represents the MPEG file format and the MPEG-4 codec. And that is how we look at video to start. Now, in our next video, we're going to move on to understanding how we start to design our projects and then we'll jump into Premiere Elements. My name is Jared Bendis. I hope this has helped you a little bit. I know it's a little bit chaotic, but what I find is that whenever you're dealing with any technical situation, you're going to see the words. You're going to see the numbers. I'm not the bad guy here. I didn't put the numbers and the words in the software, but the more I can familiarize you with them, the more you can familiarize yourself with them, the less mystery there is around these numbers, the more you'll even pass and go, okay, I know when I need to pay attention. I know what that is. I know where that comes from. Anyway, thanks for watching.